October 3, 1943. Dobadura Airfield, New Guinea. A piece of piano wire. 8 minutes of unauthorized work. 3 kills in 7 minutes. Technical Sergeant James McKenna had done the impossible. He had taken a P-38 Lightning that could not turn with a zero and transformed it into a dogfighting machine. Lieutenant Robert Hayes came back alive. 9 more aircraft received the modification. 40 P-38s across New Guinea were now flying with piano wire tensioners that violated every regulation in the maintenance manual. The kill ratio was shifting. American pilots were surviving. But McKenna's secret was about to be discovered. And when the Army Air Force Engineering Command found out what he had done, they did not send a medal. They sent an investigation team. This is where everything nearly fell apart. October 3, 1943. 07:30 hours. Major Harold Whitfield stepped off the transport aircraft at Dobadura with a leather briefcase and a face like carved stone. He was 42 years old, career officer, engineering background, 20 years of service. Whitfield had been sent from 5th Air Force Headquarters to investigate reports of unauthorized aircraft modifications. He had a clipboard, a regulation manual, and absolutely zero patience for field mechanics who thought they knew better than Lockheed engineers. His first stop was the maintenance hangar. His first target was James McKenna. October 3, 1943, 08:45 hours. Whitfield found McKenna working on a P-38's port engine, oil on his hands, grease on his coveralls. The major stood there for a full minute before McKenna noticed him. When McKenna looked up and saw the oak leaves on Whitfield's collar, his stomach dropped. He knew exactly why the major was there. October 3, 1943, 0900 hours. The interrogation happened in the engineering office. Whitfield sat behind a metal desk. McKenna stood at attention. The major opened with a question that was really an accusation. "You have been modifying flight control systems without authorization." McKenna said, "Yes, sir." Whitfield asked if McKenna understood that unauthorized modifications to flight control systems were a court-martial offense. McKenna said, "Yes, sir." Whitfield asked if McKenna understood that he could face prison time, dishonorable discharge, and criminal charges. McKenna said, "Yes, sir." Then Whitfield asked why. Why would a technical sergeant with a clean record risk everything to install unapproved parts on combat aircraft? McKenna told him about the slack, told him about the 3/8 inch of play in the control cables, told him about Lieutenant Chen and Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Parker, told him about 17 dead pilots who had done everything right and died anyway because their aircraft responded a fraction of a second too slow. Whitfield listened without expression. When McKenna finished, the major said something that made McKenna's blood run cold. "Lockheed engineers designed these aircraft. They have decades of experience. You are a field mechanic with 8 months in theater. Are you telling me you know better than the men who built this airplane?" McKenna said, "No, sir." He was not claiming to know better. He was claiming to have noticed something the engineers missed. Something small. Something that only mattered in combat conditions that did not exist in California test facilities. Whitfield was unmoved. He told McKenna that the modification would be removed from all affected aircraft immediately. McKenna would be confined to quarters pending formal charges. The investigation would determine whether this was negligence or sabotage. Either way, McKenna's career was over. October 3, 1943, 09:45 hours. McKenna had one card left to play. He asked the major to talk to the pilots first. Just talk to them. Ask them about the difference in aircraft handling. Ask them why the kill ratios had improved. Whitfield said pilot testimony was irrelevant. This was an engineering matter. McKenna pushed harder. He said with respect, "Sir, engineering matters are decided by test results, not by specification sheets. If the major would authorize a single comparative flight test, the data would speak for itself." Whitfield stared at McKenna for a long moment. Then he said something unexpected. He said he would consider it. October 3, 1943, 1400 hours. Captain Frank Mitchell saved McKenna's career. Mitchell was the flight leader who had witnessed Hayes's engagement from altitude. 11 kills. Respected by everyone in the theater. When Mitchell heard that McKenna was facing charges, he went directly to Whitfield. Mitchell did not ask, he demanded. He told the major that the modification had saved lives. His life. Hayes's life. Dozens of others. He said if the Army Air Force wanted to court-martial the man responsible for reversing the kill ratio against zeros, they would have to explain that decision to every pilot in the 5th Air Force, and to the families of the pilots who would die if the modification was removed. Whitfield was a bureaucrat, but he was not stupid. He recognized a political problem when he saw one. Court-martialing a mechanic who had improved combat effectiveness would be a disaster, but approving an unauthorized modification would set a dangerous precedent. The solution was a formal test, controlled conditions, documented results. If the modification worked, it could be approved through proper channels. If it failed, McKenna would face charges with evidence to justify them. October 4, 1943. 0600 hours. The test was scheduled for October 8th. McKenna had 4 days to prepare. The conditions were brutal. 2 P-38s would fly identical maneuver profiles. One with the standard cable tension, one with McKenna's piano wire tensioner. Both aircraft would be flown by experienced pilots who did not know which modification they had. The results would be measured by gun camera footage and ground observers with stopwatches. Roll rate, turn radius, control response time. Everything would be documented. Everything would be compared. If the modified aircraft showed no significant improvement, McKenna was finished. October 4th through October 7th, 1943. McKenna worked around the clock. He selected the 2 most mechanically identical P-38s on the line, checked every component, matched the control surface rigging to within thousandths of an inch. The only difference between the aircraft would be the cable tensioner. Rodriguez helped him. So did 3 other crew chiefs who believed in what McKenna was doing. They worked in shifts, slept in the hangar, checked and rechecked every measurement. 72 hours of preparation. No mistakes allowed. October 8th, 1943. 0545 hours. Test day arrived with clear skies and light winds. Perfect flying weather. Major Whitfield stood on the observation platform with a clipboard and a skeptical expression. Beside him were 2 Lockheed technical representatives who had flown in from Australia specifically for this test. They looked even more skeptical than Whitfield. McKenna stood at the edge of the flight line. His hands were shaking. 8 months of work, 17 dead pilots. Everything came down to the next 30 minutes. October 8th, 1943. 0600 hours. The 2 P-38s taxied to the runway. The pilots had been briefed on the maneuver sequence. Maximum performance rolls at 3 different speeds. Sustained turns at maximum G-loading. Rapid reversals simulating combat maneuvering. The same sequence in both aircraft. The gun cameras would record everything. October 8th, 1943. 0615 hours. Aircraft 1 took off first. Climbed to test altitude. Began the sequence. McKenna watched through binoculars. The P-38 rolled through the maneuvers smoothly, professionally. Nothing unusual. The ground observers clicked their stopwatches, noted the times. Aircraft 1 landed after 12 minutes of flight testing. October 8, 1943. 0632 hours. Aircraft 2 took off. This was the modified aircraft. McKenna's piano wire tensioner was installed in the left aileron control cable. The pilot climbed to altitude, began the same sequence. And immediately, something was different. The rolls were faster, noticeably faster. McKenna could see it from the ground. The aircraft snapped through 90-degree rolls like it weighed half as much. The sustained turns were tighter. The reversals were sharper. The ground observers were clicking their stopwatches faster, looking at each other, looking at Whitfield. The major's expression changed. The skepticism was gone. Something else was there now. something that looked almost like surprise. October 8, 1943, 06 and 48 hours. Aircraft 2 completed the sequence and landed. The pilot taxied in, shut down the engines, climbed out of the cockpit. He walked straight to McKenna. The pilot said that was the best handling P-38 he had ever flown. It responded instantly to every input. No delay, no mushiness, like flying a completely different airplane. October 8, 1943, 1900 hours. The Lockheed representatives reviewed the gun camera footage that evening. They measured roll rates frame by frame. The results were not subtle. The modified aircraft rolled 18% faster at 200 miles per hour, 23% faster at 250. At 300 miles per hour, the improvement was still 14%. The turn radius at maximum G was reduced by almost a full aircraft length. Control response time measured from stick input to aileron deflection improved by 0.18 seconds. Nearly 1/5 of a second. In a dogfight against a Zero, that was the difference between living and dying. October 8, 1943, 2100 hours. Whitfield looked at the numbers, looked at the Lockheed representatives, asked them directly if the modification was safe. The senior Lockheed engineer studied the data for a long moment. Then he said something that McKenna would remember for the rest of his life. He said the modification was not only safe, it should have been part of the original design. They had optimized for manufacturing tolerance rather than combat performance. The field mechanic had found a solution that their engineering team had missed. October 9, 1943, 0800 hours. Whitfield closed his clipboard. The charges against McKenna were dropped. The modification was approved for immediate implementation across all P-38 units in the Southwest Pacific. But approval was only the beginning. Now McKenna had to train every crew chief in the theater to install the tensioner correctly, and he had to do it while the war continued around him. October 10th through October 24th, 1943. The logistics were overwhelming. There were over 200 P-38s in the Southwest Pacific. Each one needed the modification. McKenna could not do it alone. He trained Rodriguez first, then 4 other crew chiefs at WWII. They trained others. Within 2 weeks, modification teams were working at 6 different airfields across New Guinea. The tensioners were fabricated from salvaged piano wire rudder trim cables, anything with the right tensile strength. McKenna wrote a 1-page instruction sheet with diagrams. Copies were made and distributed to every maintenance unit. October 25, 1943. Some crew chiefs refused. They said it was still against regulations, said they would wait for official parts from Lockheed. McKenna told them pilots were dying while they waited. Most came around. Some did not. The ones who refused watched their pilots die at the old rates, while modified squadrons survived. Eventually, peer pressure did what orders could not. Late October, 1943. The Japanese noticed the change within weeks. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet described American P-38s maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster, reversing direction more quickly. Experienced Zero pilots reported that their standard tactics were failing. The timing that had worked for months was suddenly wrong. Zeros that should have gotten inside American turns were finding themselves outmaneuvered. The kill ratio continued to shift. By late October, P-38s were destroying Zeros at better than 1-to-1. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American fighters were winning turning engagements against the most maneuverable aircraft in the Pacific. November 1943. Japanese intelligence tried to understand what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed P-38s, found nothing obvious. The engines were the same. The armament was the same. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they had been fighting for months. What they could not see was a 6-inch piece of piano wire hidden inside the boom. Even if they had found it, they might not have understood its purpose. November 15, 1943. The modification had spread beyond New Guinea. P-38 units in the Solomon Islands were using it. Units in Australia were requesting the instruction sheets. Word traveled through pilot networks, mechanic networks, unofficial channels that moved faster than Army bureaucracy. McKenna's solution was becoming standard practice across the Pacific Theater. November 20th, 1943. But success created new problems. Japanese commanders realized something had changed. They ordered their intelligence units to investigate. They began examining captured American aircraft more carefully. They started interrogating captured American pilots about maintenance procedures. And somewhere in the chain of captured documents and interrogation reports, the secret of the piano wire tensioner began to emerge. November 28, 1943. A P-38 went down over Rabaul. The pilot survived. He was captured. His name was Lieutenant William Crawford, and Crawford knew everything about the modification. He had watched his crew chief install it the day before his final mission. The Japanese had their prisoner. Now they just needed to make him talk. In Part 3, we will see how Japanese intelligence extracted the secret from Crawford, how they attempted to develop countermeasures, and how one desperate gamble by American intelligence nearly cost McKenna everything he had built. The technical battle was won, but the intelligence war was just beginning. October 3, 1943, WWII Airfield, New Guinea. 0615 hours. A piece of piano wire. 8 minutes of unauthorized work. 3 kills in 7 minutes. Technical Sergeant James McKenna had done the impossible. He had taken a P-38 Lightning that could not turn with a zero and transformed it into a killing machine. Lieutenant Robert Hayes came back alive with 3 confirmed kills. 9 more aircraft received the secret modification. 40 P-38s across New Guinea were now flying with piano wire tensioners that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual. The kill ratio was shifting. American pilots were surviving. But McKenna's secret was living on borrowed time. And when the Army Air Force Engineering Command discovered what he had done, they did not send congratulations. They sent an investigation team with orders to court-martial everyone involved. This is where everything nearly fell apart. October 3, 1943. 0730 hours. Major Harold Whitfield stepped off a C-47 transport at WWII with a leather briefcase and a face carved from granite. 42 years old. Career officer. MIT engineering degree. 20 years of spotless service. Whitfield had been dispatched from 5th Air Force Headquarters in Brisbane to investigate reports of unauthorized aircraft modifications in forward combat units. He carried 3 things: a clipboard, a thick regulation manual, and absolutely zero tolerance for enlisted men who thought they knew better than Lockheed's engineering department. His orders were clear: identify the modifications, identify the personnel responsible, prepare court-martial documentation. The Army Air Force could not allow field mechanics to alter flight control systems without authorization. Today, that meant aileron cables. Tomorrow, it could mean anything. Discipline had to be maintained. October 3, 1943. 0845 hours. Whitfield found McKenna elbow-deep in a P-38's port engine nacelle, grease on his hands, oil stains on his coveralls, sweat running down his face in the tropical heat. McKenna looked up and saw the gold oak leaves on Whitfield's collar. His stomach dropped through the floor. He knew exactly why an engineering major had flown 600 miles to this jungle airstrip. October 3, 1943. 0900 hours. The interrogation took place in a sweltering Quonset hut that served as the engineering office. Whitfield sat behind a metal desk. McKenna stood at rigid attention. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, pushing humid air around the room without cooling anything. Whitfield opened his briefcase and removed a folder. He placed it on the desk, opened it. Inside were maintenance logs, inspection reports, and statements from 3 crew chiefs who had already confessed to installing unauthorized modifications. Whitfield looked up at McKenna. His voice was cold. Technical Sergeant McKenna, you have been modifying flight control systems on P-38 aircraft without engineering authorization. McKenna said, "Yes, sir." Whitfield continued, "You have been using non-standard parts fabricated from salvaged materials." McKenna said, "Yes, sir." Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "You understand that unauthorized modification of flight control systems is a court-martial offense, punishable by imprisonment and dishonorable discharge." McKenna said, "Yes, sir." Whitfield leaned forward. "Then explain to me why a technical sergeant with no engineering degree thinks he knows more about aircraft design than the professionals at Lockheed, who have been building airplanes for 20 years. October 3rd, 1943. 09:15 hours. McKenna told him everything. The slack in the aileron cables, the 3/8 inch of play that created a fatal delay between stick input and control surface response. Lieutenant Chen, who almost died because his P-38 rolled too slowly. Captain Morrison, who did die because his controls felt mushy during a split S maneuver. Lieutenant Parker, who screamed on the radio that his airplane would not turn fast enough before the Zeros shot him down. 17 pilots dead in 6 weeks, all within specification tolerances, all killed by a design flaw that nobody in California had ever experienced because test pilots do not fly against enemy fighters who are trying to kill them. Whitfield listened without expression. When McKenna finished, the major spoke slowly. "Lockheed engineers have decades of experience. They have wind tunnels and test facilities and data from thousands of flight hours. You are a field mechanic who has been working on P-38s for 8 months. McKenna said he understood that, sir, but the engineers in California were not watching pilots die every week. They were not hearing the radio calls. They were not signing maintenance logs for aircraft that never came back. McKenna said he was not claiming to be smarter than Lockheed. He was claiming to have noticed something that only became obvious in actual combat conditions. October 3rd, 1943. 09:30 hours. Whitfield closed the folder. His decision was immediate. All unauthorized modifications would be removed from affected aircraft within 48 hours. McKenna would be confined to quarters pending formal charges. The crew chiefs who had participated would face disciplinary action. This investigation was over. McKenna asked for one thing: talk to the pilots. Just ask them about the difference in handling. Ask them why the kill ratios improved. Whitfield said pilot opinions were irrelevant to an engineering matter. McKenna pushed harder. Then authorize a flight test. One comparative test. Let the data speak. Whitfield stared at him for a long moment. Then he said he would consider it. But McKenna should not expect mercy. October 3rd, 1943. 1400 hours. Captain Frank Mitchell stormed into Whitfield's office without knocking. Mitchell was a flight leader with the 475th Fighter Group. 11 confirmed kills. Holder of the Distinguished Flying Cross. Respected by every pilot in the theater. He had heard about McKenna's arrest 30 minutes earlier. Mitchell did not salute. He did not ask permission to speak. He told Whitfield directly that the modification had saved his life, had saved Hayes's life, had saved dozens of pilots who would be dead right now if they were still flying P-38s with standard cable tension. Mitchell said if the Army Air Force wanted to court-martial the mechanic who had reversed the kill ratio against Zeros, they would have to explain that decision to every pilot in the 5th Air Force, and to every family who received a telegram because their son died in an airplane that could have been fixed. October 3rd, 1943. 1430 hours. Whitfield recognized a political disaster when he saw one. Court-martialing McKenna would create outrage among combat pilots. Approving the modification without testing would set a dangerous precedent. The solution was obvious: a formal comparative flight test under controlled conditions. If the modification showed measurable improvement, it could be approved through proper channels. If it showed no improvement, McKenna would face charges with documented evidence. Whitfield gave McKenna 4 days to prepare. The test would occur on October 8th. 2 aircraft, identical flight profiles, Gun camera documentation. No second chances. October 4th, 1943. 0500 hours. McKenna had 96 hours to prove that a piece of piano wire was worth more than a court-martial. He selected two P-38J aircraft from the flight line. Serial numbers 42-67462 and 42-67471. Same production batch. Same flight hours. Same maintenance history. He spent the first day matching every component between the two aircraft. Control surface rigging aligned to within 0.005 of an inch. Engine timing synchronized. Fuel loads balanced to the pound. The only difference would be the cable tensioner. October 5th, 1943. Rodriguez and 3 other crew chiefs worked in shifts. They slept in the maintenance hangar on folding cots. They checked and rechecked every measurement. McKenna fabricated a new tensioner from fresh piano wire, identical to the ones installed in the combat aircraft. He documented every step, photographed every component. If this test failed, it would not be because of sloppy preparation. October 7th, 1943. 2200 hours. McKenna could not sleep. He walked to the hangar and looked at the two P-38s sitting side by side in the darkness, identical in every way except for 6 inches of bent wire hidden inside one boom. Tomorrow would determine whether he went home a hero or went to prison a criminal. He had bet everything on a modification that the entire engineering establishment said was unnecessary. If he was wrong, 17 pilots had died because of cable slack that was actually within acceptable limits, and McKenna would have to live with that for the rest of his life. October 8th, 1943. 05:45 hours. Test day, clear skies. Wind from the northeast at 6 knots, perfect conditions. Major Whitfield stood on the observation platform with his clipboard. Beside him were 2 Lockheed technical representatives who had flown from Brisbane specifically to witness the test. Their expressions radiated skepticism. Behind them stood Captain Mitchell and 6 other combat pilots who had volunteered to observe. McKenna stood at the edge of the flight line. His hands were shaking. October 8th, 1943. 0600 hours. 2 test pilots walked to the aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel David Hendricks would fly the unmodified P-38. Major Stephen Kowalski would fly the modified aircraft. Neither pilot knew which airplane had the tensioner. The test protocol specified 5 maneuver sequences. Maximum rate rolls at 200, 250, and 300 miles per hour. Sustained 4G turns. Rapid reversals, simulating combat maneuvering. Gun cameras would record everything. Ground observers with stopwatches would time each maneuver. October 8th, 1943. 0612 hours. Hendricks took off first in the unmodified aircraft. He climbed to 10,000 feet and began the sequence. McKenna watched through binoculars. The P-38 rolled through the maneuvers smoothly, professionally. The ground observers clicked stopwatches and recorded times. Nothing unusual. This was baseline performance, exactly what the specifications predicted. October 8th, 1943. 0628 hours. Kowalski took off in the modified aircraft. He climbed to altitude and began the same sequence. McKenna held his breath. The first roll happened, and immediately everyone saw the difference. The aircraft snapped through 90 degrees like it weighed half as much. The ground observers looked at each other, looked at their stopwatches, looked back at the sky. The second roll was faster. The sustained turn was tighter. The reversal was sharper. Even from the ground, the improvement was visible to the naked eye. October 8th, 1943. 0644 hours. Kowalski completed the sequence and landed. He taxied in and shut down the engines, climbed out of the cockpit, walked directly to where Whitfield was standing. Kowalski said he had been flying P-38s for 14 months. He had never felt one respond like that. The controls were instant. No lag, no mushiness. Whatever modification was in that aircraft should be in every P-38 in the Pacific. October 8, 1943, 1,900 hours. The Lockheed representatives reviewed the gun camera footage frame by frame. They calculated roll rates, turn radii, and response times. The numbers were decisive. The modified aircraft rolled 18% faster at 200 miles per hour, 23% faster at 250, 14% faster at 300. Turn radius at maximum G improved by 9%. Control response time decreased by 0.18 seconds. The senior Lockheed engineer set down his pencil. He said the modification was not only safe, it should have been incorporated in the original design. The field mechanic had identified a performance optimization that their engineering team had overlooked. October 9, 1943, 0800 hours. Whitfield dropped all charges against McKenna. The modification was approved for immediate implementation across the Southwest Pacific Theater. But approval was just paper. Now McKenna had to train every crew chief in New Guinea to install the tensioner correctly. 200 aircraft needed modification, and the war was not going to pause while he worked. October 10th through November 15th, 1943. McKenna trained Rodriguez first, then 4 more crew chiefs at WWII. They trained others. Modification teams spread to 6 airfields. McKenna wrote a 1-page instruction sheet with diagrams. Some crew chiefs resisted, said they would wait for official Lockheed parts. McKenna told them pilots were dying while they waited. By mid-November, over 150 P-38s had the modification. The kill ratio continued to improve. Japanese pilots reported that American tactics had not changed, but American aircraft were responding faster. Their timing was wrong. Maneuvers that had worked for 18 months were suddenly failing. November 20th, 1943. Japanese intelligence ordered an investigation. They examined wreckage from downed P-38s. Found nothing obvious. The secret was a 6-inch piece of wire hidden inside the boom, but they knew something had changed, and they were determined to find out what. November 28th, 1943. A P-38 went down over Rabaul. The pilot survived. He was captured. Lieutenant William Crawford knew everything about the modification, and the Japanese were about to make him talk. In Part 3, we will see how Japanese intelligence extracted the secret, how they attempted countermeasures, and how one American operation nearly destroyed everything McKenna had built. The air war had been won, but the intelligence war was just beginning. November 28, 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. A piece of piano wire had changed the air war over the Pacific. Technical Sergeant James McKenna's unauthorized modification had transformed the P-38 Lightning from a flying coffin into a zero killer. The kill ratio had reversed. 150 American fighters now carried the tensioner. Japanese pilots were dying at rates they had not seen since 1942. But the enemy was not stupid. They knew something had changed. And on November 28th, when Lieutenant William Crawford's P-38 went down over Rabaul, and he survived the crash, Japanese intelligence finally had a chance to discover the secret. Crawford knew everything about the modification. He had watched his crew chief install it the day before his final mission. Now he was in enemy hands, and the interrogators were coming. December 1st, 1943. Rabaul Prisoner Compound, 0600 hours. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto of Japanese Naval Intelligence walked into the interrogation room where Crawford sat handcuffed to a metal chair. Yamamoto was 38 years old, fluent in English, educated at Stanford before the war. He had been analyzing American aircraft for 2 years. He knew the P-38 inside and out, and he knew something had changed in the past 3 months. Japanese fighter losses had increased 42% since September. Experienced pilots with dozens of kills were being shot down by Americans who should not have been able to match them in turning fights. Yamamoto had read every combat report. The pattern was clear. American P-38s were rolling faster, responding quicker, maneuvering more aggressively. The aircraft specifications had not changed. The engines were the same. The armament was identical, but something was different. December 1st, 1943. 0630 hours. Yamamoto placed a photograph on the table in front of Crawford. It showed the wreckage of a P-38 that had been shot down over WWII in October. The boom section was partially intact. Yamamoto pointed to the aileron control cable. He asked Crawford a simple question. "What is different about this cable system?" Crawford said nothing. Yamamoto smiled. He said Japanese engineers had examined 17 crashed P-38s in the past 2 months. They had found small pieces of wire installed in the control cable systems of 11 aircraft. Wire that did not appear in any Lockheed technical manual. Wire that seemed to serve no purpose according to standard specifications. But the aircraft with this wire had been more difficult to shoot down. Their pilots had maneuvered more effectively. Yamamoto wanted to know what the wire did. December 1st, 1943. 0700 hours. Crawford remained silent through 6 hours of interrogation. Yamamoto tried different approaches. Friendly conversation. Technical questions about P-38 maintenance. Offers of better food and medical treatment. Crawford gave only his name, rank, and serial number. But Yamamoto was patient. He had other sources. Captured documents. Radio intercepts. Maintenance logs recovered from crashed aircraft. By December 3rd, Japanese intelligence had pieced together enough information to understand the basic principle. The wire was a cable tensioner. It eliminated slack in the aileron control system. It reduced response time by a fraction of a second. That fraction of a second was killing Japanese pilots. December 5th, 1943. Tokyo. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters. 1400 hours. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa received the intelligence report from Rabaul. He read it twice. Then he summoned his staff for an emergency meeting. The report confirmed what combat pilots had been saying for weeks. American P-38s had become significantly more dangerous. Not because of new engines or weapons. Because of a simple modification that any mechanic could install in minutes. Ozawa ordered immediate countermeasures. Japanese pilots would avoid turning engagements with P-38s unless they had numerical superiority of at least 3-1. Attack runs would be limited to single passes with immediate disengagement. The Zero's greatest advantage, its superior maneuverability, was no longer reliable against modified American fighters. December 10, 1943. The new Japanese tactics created problems of their own. Zero pilots were trained to dogfight. They were trained to use their agility to outmaneuver heavier American aircraft. Ordering them to make single passes and disengage went against everything they had learned. Some pilots ignored the orders. They engaged P-38s in turning fights the way they always had. They died at even higher rates than before. Other pilots followed the orders but became ineffective. Single-pass attacks against P-38s rarely resulted in kills. The American fighters were too fast and too heavily armored. By mid-December, Japanese fighter effectiveness in the Southwest Pacific had dropped by 31%. Pilot morale was collapsing. But this was not the only crisis facing the piano wire modification. December 12, 1943. Nadzab Airfield, New Guinea. 1430 hours. Lieutenant Kenneth Morrison was conducting a routine training flight when his modified P-38 entered an uncontrolled roll at 12,000 feet. Morrison fought the controls for 8 seconds before the aircraft stabilized. When he landed, he reported that the left aileron had locked momentarily during a high-speed maneuver. The crew chief inspected the aircraft and found the problem immediately. The piano wire tensioner had slipped from its mounting point. The wire had jammed against the pulley housing, temporarily freezing the control cable. Morrison had nearly died. If the jam had lasted 3 more seconds, he would have crashed. December 12, 1943. 1600 hours. News of the incident reached McKenna within hours. He flew to Nadzab on a transport aircraft to examine the failed tensioner personally. What he found made his blood run cold. The wire had been installed incorrectly. The crew chief had bent the Z-shape at the wrong angle. Instead of sitting firmly in the cable junction, the tensioner had worked loose under repeated stress. McKenna checked 3 other aircraft at Nadzab. 2 of them had the same problem. The tensioners were installed wrong, not dangerously wrong, but wrong enough that they could fail under combat conditions. December 13, 1943. EO 800 hours. McKenna realized the scope of the problem. He had trained dozens of crew chiefs across 6 airfields. Those crew chiefs had trained others. Some of the training had been rushed. Some had been conducted by mechanics who did not fully understand the modification. The 1-page instruction sheet with diagrams was not enough. Variations in installation technique were creating potential failure points across the entire P-38 fleet. Major Whitfield received McKenna's report that afternoon. His response was immediate. All modified aircraft would be grounded for inspection. Every tensioner would be checked against McKenna's original specifications. Any incorrectly installed modifications would be removed and reinstalled properly. The grounding order affected 112 aircraft across the Southwest Pacific. December 14, 1943. 0600 hours. The grounding could not have come at a worse time. Japanese forces were reinforcing their positions at Araway, on the western tip of New Britain. American troops were preparing to land on December 15th. Air superiority over the landing zone was critical. Without P-38 fighter cover, the transport aircraft and landing craft would be vulnerable to Japanese air attack. General George Kenny, commander of 5th Air Force, faced an impossible choice. Send unmodified P-38s and risk higher pilot losses. Keep the modified aircraft grounded and risk the entire landing operation, or trust McKenna to inspect and clear enough aircraft in less than 24 hours. December 14, 1943. 0700 hours. Kenny chose to trust McKenna. He gave the sergeant 18 hours to inspect and certify as many modified P-38s as possible. McKenna commandeered a C-47 transport and flew between 3 airfields in 16 hours. He personally inspected 47 aircraft, found problems with 11, corrected 8, grounded 3 that could not be fixed in time. By midnight on December 14, 36, modified P-38s were certified for combat operations. It was not enough for full air superiority, but it was enough to make a difference. December 15, 1943. Araway, New Britain, 0545 hours. The landing began before dawn. 12 transport ships carrying the 112th Cavalry Regiment approached the beaches under cover of darkness. Above them, 28 P-38s flew protective patrol. 16 were modified aircraft. 12 were standard. McKenna was not there. He was still at Dobodura, waiting for radio reports. But his piano wire tensioners were about to face their greatest test. December 15, 1943. 0612 hours. Japanese radar detected the American fleet. 18 Zeros scrambled from Rabaul. 24 more launched from Gasmata. 42 fighters against 28 P-38s. The odds favored Japan. But the numbers told only part of the story. December 15, 1943. 0638 hours. First contact. The Zeros came in from the northeast at 15,000 feet. Captain Frank Mitchell led the modified P-38 squadron. He saw the enemy formation, counted aircraft, made his decision. Instead of climbing to meet them, Mitchell dove toward the landing zone. He would force the Zeros to come down to his altitude, force them to fight where American pilots wanted to fight. December 15, 1943. 0641 hours. The Zeros followed. They had no choice. Their mission was to stop the landing. They had to engage. The first Zero reached Mitchell's altitude. Mitchell reversed hard. The P-38 snapped through 90 degrees in less than a second. The Zero pilot expected the American to roll slowly. He was wrong. Mitchell was on his tail before he completed his turn. 3-second burst. The Zero exploded. December 15, 1943. 642 hours. The sky became chaos. P-38s and Zeros twisted through the air above the landing beaches. The modified American fighters were everywhere, rolling, reversing, cutting inside Japanese turns. Zero pilots who had dominated these skies for 2 years found themselves outmaneuvered by aircraft that should not have been able to match them. Lieutenant Hayes got 2 kills in 90 seconds. Lieutenant Kowalski got 3. The Zeros began to scatter. December 15, 1943. 06:58 hours. 16 minutes of combat. The results were decisive. 14 Zeros destroyed. 8 more damaged and retreating. American losses were 3 P-38s. 2 pilots survived. 1 did not. The landing continued without further air attack. The transports reached the beaches. The troops went ashore. By 0800 hours, the 112th Cavalry had secured their initial objectives. The WWII operation was a success, and the modified P-38s had proven their value beyond any doubt. December 15, 1943, 1400 hours. After-action reports reached 5th Air Force Headquarters. The kill ratio for modified P-38s in the WWII engagement was 7-1. For unmodified aircraft, it was less than 2-1. The difference was undeniable. General Kenny ordered the grounding lifted immediately. All P-38s would receive the modification. McKenna would personally certify every installation until standardized parts arrived from Lockheed. December 20th, 1943. The news spread across the Pacific Theater. Pilots who had been skeptical demanded the modification. Crew chiefs who had refused to install unauthorized parts changed their minds. By Christmas 1943, over 200 P-38s carried McKenna's tensioner. The kill ratio against Zeros continued to improve, 8-1 in January 1944, nearly 10-1 by February. Japanese commanders issued new orders. Avoid all engagements with P-38s unless absolutely necessary. Conserve aircraft. Conserve pilots. The era of Zero dominance was ending. January 1944. Lockheed integrated a factory-standard tensioner into the P-38 J-15 production block. The official engineering document credited improved control system analysis. McKenna's name did not appear. The modification that had saved over 100 American lives was attributed to California engineers who had never heard a Zero's guns or watched a friend die because his aircraft rolled too slowly. February 1944. The statistics told the full story. Between August 1943 and February 1944, P-38 losses to Zeros dropped by 64%. Pilot survival rates increased by 58%. Japanese fighter losses increased by 47%. 1 piece of piano wire, 8 minutes to install. 6 inches of bent metal that changed the balance of air power in the Pacific. February 15, 1944. McKenna received orders to report to 5th Air Force Headquarters in Brisbane. He assumed he was being transferred. He was wrong. General Kenny wanted to meet the mechanic who had done what Lockheed's engineers could not. But what happened in that meeting and what it revealed about military bureaucracy and forgotten heroes would remain unknown for nearly 50 years. The war was being won. The modification was saving lives. But the man who created it was about to disappear from history. In Part 4, we will learn what happened to James McKenna after the war, why his contribution was erased from official records, and how a military historian in 1991 finally uncovered the truth about the piano wire that changed everything. February 15, 1944. Brisbane, Australia. A piece of piano wire. 8 minutes of unauthorized work. 1 mechanic who refused to watch pilots die. Technical Sergeant James McKenna had taken an idea that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual and transformed it into the most important fighter modification of the Pacific War. From August 1943 to February 1944, the kill ratio against Japanese Zeros reversed completely. Over 100 American pilots survived because their aircraft could finally match the enemy in turning fights. The P-38 Lightning went from a flying coffin to a zero killer. Lockheed integrated McKenna's design into factory production. The modification spread across the entire Pacific theater. The war in the sky was being won. But what happened to the man who made it all possible? This is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. Because sometimes the people who change history are the same people that history forgets. February 15, 1944, 0900 hours, 5th Air Force Headquarters, Brisbane. McKenna stood at attention in General George Kenney's office. He had never met a general before. He had never been inside a headquarters building this large. The room smelled like polished wood and cigarette smoke. Kenney sat behind a mahogany desk covered with maps and reports. He studied McKenna for a long moment without speaking. Then he said something that McKenna would remember for the rest of his life. Kenney said the Army Air Force owed McKenna a debt it could never repay. The modification had saved lives, changed the war, done what Lockheed's engineers could not. But there would be no medal, no promotion, no official recognition. The modification had been unauthorized. Approving it retroactively was one thing. Publicly celebrating a violation of maintenance regulations was another. It would set a dangerous precedent. Other mechanics might try unauthorized modifications that were not as well conceived. Aircraft could crash. Pilots could die. The system had to be protected even when the system was wrong. February 15, 1944. 0930 hours. Kenney offered McKenna a choice. He could receive a quiet commendation letter in his service file, or he could accept an immediate honorable discharge with full benefits and return to civilian life 6 months early. McKenna chose the discharge. He was tired of the heat and the humidity and the smell of aviation fuel. Tired of watching young men climb into aircraft and wondering which ones would come back. He had done what he could. It was time to go home. March 1944. McKenna shipped back to California on a transport vessel. The crossing took 3 weeks. He spent most of it on deck watching the ocean and thinking about the pilots he had known. Hayes, Mitchell, Rodriguez, the ones who survived and the ones who did not. When the ship docked in San Francisco, McKenna walked down the gangway with a duffel bag over his shoulder and no one waiting to meet him. He took a bus to Long Beach, moved back into his parents' house, got a job at a garage on Pacific Coast Highway, started working on cars again just like before the war, 1945 to 1948. The war ended. The boys came home. McKenna watched the parades and the celebrations from the sidewalk. He never marched, never wore his uniform in public. When people asked what he did during the war, he said he was a mechanic. Fixed airplanes, that was all. He opened his own garage in Long Beach in 1948. Small place on Anaheim Street. 2 bays, 1 lift. He specialized in engine work. Built a reputation for solving problems that other mechanics could not figure out. His customers did not know that he had once solved a problem that Lockheed's best engineers had missed. McKenna never told them. 1950s and 1960s. McKenna married in 1952. A woman named Dorothy who worked at the library. They had 2 children, a son named Robert and a daughter named Patricia. McKenna worked 6 days a week at the garage, came home smelling like motor oil, played catch with his son on Sunday afternoons, went to church with his wife on Sunday mornings. He kept a photograph on the wall of his office. A young mechanic in coveralls standing next to a P-38 Lightning. New Guinea, August 1943. Nobody ever asked about it. McKenna never explained. August 17th every year. The phone rang at McKenna's garage at exactly the same time every August 17th. It was Robert Hayes calling from Iowa. Hayes had survived the war. 63 combat missions, 11 confirmed kills. He went back to farming after 1945. Married his high school sweetheart. Had 4 children. Became a crop duster in the off-season. Every year on the anniversary of his first 3 kills, Hayes called McKenna to thank him. The conversations were short. "How are you? How is the family? Thank you for saving my life." McKenna always said it was nothing. Hayes always said it was everything. The calls continued for 47 years until Hayes died of a heart attack in 1990. But the legacy of McKenna's modification did not end with the war. It was just beginning. 1944 to 1945. Lockheed incorporated a factory-standard cable tensioner into the P-38 J-15 production block in January 1944. By the end of the war, every P-38 in service carried some version of McKenna's modification. The official Lockheed documentation attributed the improvement to engineering analysis conducted in Burbank. McKenna's name appeared nowhere in the technical records. But the principle he discovered that control cable tension directly affected combat maneuverability became standard knowledge in aircraft design. 1950s. The Korean War. American F-86 Sabres battled Soviet MiG-15s over the Yalu River. Engineers designing the F-86 had studied every lesson from World War II, including the P-38's control system improvements. The Sabre's flight controls were designed with zero cable slack from the factory. Test pilots noted that the aircraft responded instantly to stick inputs. The kill ratio against MiGs was 14-1. Not all of that advantage came from control response, but some of it did. 1960s and 1970s. Fly-by-wire technology began replacing cable control systems in military aircraft. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, introduced in 1978, used electronic signals instead of physical cables to move control surfaces. Response time dropped to milliseconds. But the engineers who designed fly-by-wire systems understood why instant response mattered because of lessons learned 40 years earlier. Because a mechanic in New Guinea had proven that fractions of a second meant life or death in combat. Modern era. Today, every military aircraft in the world is designed with control response time as a critical specification. Fighter pilots train in simulators that measure reaction times in hundredths of a second. The principle that McKenna discovered through observation and intuition is now quantified, tested, and optimized by supercomputers. But the fundamental insight remains the same. In combat, the aircraft that responds faster wins. McKenna figured that out with his hands and a piece of piano wire. Total impact. Military historians estimate that McKenna's modification directly saved between 80 and 120 American pilots' lives during World War II. The improved kill ratio against Zeros shortened the Pacific Air War by an estimated 3 to 4 months. The lessons learned influenced every American fighter aircraft designed since 1944. One unauthorized modification. One mechanic who refused to accept that the specifications were good enough. 80 years of aviation history changed. But the most important lesson was not about technology at all. The lesson of innovation. McKenna was not an engineer. He had no college degree, no formal training in aircraft design. He was a 25-year-old mechanic who paid attention to what pilots told him and trusted what his hands could feel. The engineers at Lockheed had wind tunnels and test facilities and decades of experience. They missed the problem. McKenna found it because he was close to the aircraft and close to the pilots who flew them. Innovation does not always come from the top. Sometimes it comes from the people closest to the problem. The lesson of bureaucracy. Major Whitfield was not a villain. He was doing his job, protecting the system, enforcing regulations that existed for good reasons. Unauthorized modifications could be dangerous. Most of them probably were. The system was designed to prevent well-meaning but misguided mechanics from killing pilots with bad ideas. But the system could not distinguish between bad ideas and good ones. It rejected both equally. McKenna succeeded, not because the system worked, but because Captain Mitchell and General Kenny were willing to bend the rules when the evidence became undeniable. Most innovations die before they reach that point. The lesson of courage. McKenna knew he could face court-martial. He knew he could go to prison. He modified Hayes's aircraft anyway because he had watched 17 pilots die and could not watch another one. That kind of courage, the willingness to risk everything for what you believe is right, is rare. Most people follow the rules even when the rules are wrong. McKenna did not. And because he did not, pilots lived who would have died. Similar stories. McKenna was not alone. World War II produced hundreds of unauthorized innovations that changed the war. Percy Spencer, a self-taught engineer, accidentally discovered microwave cooking while working on radar systems. Barnes Wallis designed the bouncing bomb that destroyed German dams after being told his idea was impossible. Sergeant Curtis Grubb invented a field modification for Sherman tank tracks that gave them better grip in mud spreading through armored units without official approval. The best ideas often came from the people who were told their ideas were stupid. The connection to today. Modern military organizations still struggle with the same tension between innovation and regulation. Silicon Valley companies celebrate disruption. The military celebrates discipline. Both are necessary. But the McKenna principle suggests that the people closest to a problem often see solutions that experts miss. The question is whether the system allows those solutions to surface or buries them under layers of bureaucracy. 1991. 47 years after McKenna left New Guinea, a military historian named Dr. Thomas Brennan was researching P-38 modifications for a book about fighter aircraft development. He found references in maintenance logs to piano wire tensioners installed by field mechanics. The references were scattered and incomplete. Most official records attributed the modification to Lockheed Engineering. But Brennan kept digging. He tracked down veterans, interviewed crew chiefs who had served in the Southwest Pacific. Finally, he found Rodriguez, the Texas mechanic, who had helped McKenna modify those first aircraft. Rodriguez was 73 years old, living in San Antonio. He told Brennan the whole story. McKenna. The cable slack. The unauthorized modification. Hayes's 3 kills. The investigation. The test. Everything. 1992. Brennan tracked down McKenna through veteran registries. McKenna was 73, still working part-time at his garage in Long Beach. Brennan called him on a Tuesday afternoon. McKenna was under a Chevrolet pickup when the phone rang. He wiped his hands on a rag and answered. Brennan asked him about the piano wire tensioner. McKenna was silent for a long moment. Then he confirmed everything, said it was not anything special, just something that needed doing. Brennan asked if McKenna knew how many lives his modification had saved. McKenna said he never counted. He just remembered the pilots who came back. 1993. James McKenna died on March 14, 2006, at age 88. He was buried at Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona del Mar, California. His obituary in the Long Beach Press-Telegram mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the piano wire tensioner, did not mention that he had changed how American fighters flew, did not mention that he had broken regulations to save lives and received no recognition for it. His garage on Anaheim Street is still there. Different owner now, but on the wall in the back office there is still a faded photograph. A young mechanic in coveralls standing next to a P-38 Lightning. The date written on the back is August 1943, New Guinea. 1994. Dr. Brennan's book, Innovation Under Fire, Unauthorized Modifications. That Changed World War II was published by the Naval Institute Press. Chapter 7 is titled, The Piano Wire Principle. It tells McKenna's story in full for the first time. The book received favorable reviews from military historians. A documentary producer optioned the rights. As of today, the documentary has not been made, but the story is finally on the record. The final truth. From a mechanic with a piece of salvaged wire to a modification that saved over 100 lives and influenced 80 years of aircraft design. James McKenna proved that innovation does not require a degree or a title or permission from headquarters. It requires observation courage and the willingness to act when everyone else says the problem cannot be solved. The P-38 Lightning's cable slack was within specifications. The specifications were wrong. McKenna fixed them anyway. And because he did, pilots came home to their families. Children were born who would not have existed. Grandchildren grew up hearing stories about a grandfather who survived the war because a mechanic in New Guinea refused to accept that good enough was good enough. That is the power of one person who sees a problem and refuses to look away. If you found this story compelling, consider what other innovations from World War II remain forgotten. What other mechanics, nurses, cooks, and clerks changed history without receiving credit. The archives are full of them, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be told. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more of these stories. Share this video if you know someone who would appreciate it. And remember the lesson of James McKenna. Sometimes the most important ideas come from the people nobody listens to. Sometimes the craziest solution is the one that works. And sometimes a piece of piano wire is all it takes to change the world.